The Testimonium Flavianum, the mentioning of Jesus Christ in the work of Josephus, is considered by many to be a later addition, but there are very good reasons to disagree with this argument, as mentions of this name appear in his other works as well. Josephus, or the man who wrote using that name, if you are familiar with my work you will be familiar with the name Arrius Piso, also had a reason to write a mention or two of Jesus for the purpose of historicizing him. It is not only Jesus that is historicized, but other fictional characters are too, such as John the Baptist and James the brother of Jesus. A better translation is actually James by name, which is the same wording Suetonius used when mentioning Josephus. The case in favour of the mention of Jesus Christ in the works of Flavius Josephus is based upon mere speculation. The main reason used seems to be that the mention of Christ was not found mentioned until the time of Eusebius. Being able to understand ancient literature is a very complex undertaking, and much more so than traditional scholarship is currently teaching. In my view, there is no motive for anything to be added to the works of Josephus, as doing so would only bring attention to that work, which, judging by what has been found within that work, would be counterproductive for the Church. In the Textus Receptus, Latin for received text, it reads, "And there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if indeed it is necessary to call him a man, for he was a doer of paradoxical works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure, and many Jews on the one hand, and also many of the Greeks on the other, he drew to himself." He was the Messiah. And when, on the accusation of some of the principal men among us, Pilate had condemned him to a cross, those who had first loved him did not cease to do so, for he appeared to them on the third day, living again, the divine prophets having related both these things and countless other marvels about him. And even till now the tribe of Christians, so named from this man, has not gone extinct. Here is the Testimonium in the Codex Vossianus from the early 15th century. The Protestant scholar Lucas Osiander expressed his doubts regarding this passage's authenticity, stating, "If Josephus had felt what he asserted in that testimony, he would have been a Christian. However, nothing with even a whiff of Christianity can be found in his writings." The substantial error of the final sentence in the above statement will be shown below. But others of the time likewise doubted its authenticity. Origen's assertion that Josephus did not believe in Jesus as the Christ, and contradicts the Testimonium passage, was pointed out by the reformed French scholar Tanquilius Faber. Louis Capel, a French Protestant scholar, held the view that the passage did not seem to fit well into its surrounding narrative. By the 20th century, both Jewish and Christian scholars appear to have majorly reassessed the origins of Christianity, in the context of Second Temple Judaism and the events after. The conclusion reached by scholars, and still held to this day by a majority, is that although the passage has some clear later Christian additions, it is partially authentic. Some may still hold the view that the style of writing used in this portion of the work may indeed differ slightly from the majority of the work, but for this there are explanations as of yet not considered. When the earliest known copies in the original Greek of the works of Flavius Josephus are read, the style of the passage mentioning Jesus appears no different than other parts. Differences will be seen in later copies that are not true to the primary sources. It perhaps need not be said here, but there are also style differences in the later translations in Latin, and interpolations in later copies from Latin copies. In the letters of Pliny the Younger, we read, "You ask me what I think you should study while you enjoy your current vacation. It is really useful, as many propose, to translate Greek into Latin or Latin into Greek. By this kind of exercise you gain the proper and decorative use of words, an abundance of rhetorical devices, a forceful manner of explication, and, importantly, an ability to compose similar works due to the imitation of the best models. The things which escape a reader, moreover, do not evade a translator. From this practice one acquires intelligence and critical judgment." The translating into Latin is what eventually happened with the New Testament, so people could not see what was originally in the original Greek version. Then the New Testament was translated from the Latin translation into other languages. But returning to scholar Lucas Osiander's statement above, his view that not even a whiff of Christianity is to be found in Josephus's writings is incorrect. Presented here are 40 correlations between the works of the man known as Flavius Josephus and the Gospels. If the correlations shown were removed, it is clear the writings of Josephus would simply not be coherent. Shown here are several mentions from the list just shown in the writings of Josephus that would have had to have been added throughout the texts as they were being written. Now, there was about this time Jesus, a wise man. He was the Christ, and the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day. Christ, in Jewish Antiquities, is referring to Jesus, son of Danius, John the Baptist, and the indirect mention of Christ by speaking of his brother, and brought before them the brother of Jesus who was called the Christ. These works contain phrases that could appear to the literary untrained, which was the entire population except for the elite, to be referring to the Jesus of the Gospels. Good examples are a certain Galilean, in order to avenge themselves upon one Galilean only. Note, Judas of Galilee is the Galilean being spoken of here. Jesus and his followers. I must also note, albeit at the risk of being trivial, that within the same paragraph just mentioned, regarding a certain Galilean, the word evil is used instead of the word bad, another New Testament connection. I doubt many would argue that the work by the man known as Josephus is so large, carefully written and detailed, that it shows he had much to say. If the many Christian references noted above within that work were removed, it would become unreadable, and that is certainly not the way this individual wrote. If the above information is not considered enough to prove beyond all reasonable doubt that Josephus, or rather Arrius Piso, did originally mention Jesus, and that he had done so for a specific purpose, there are still the citations in the appendix of Wisdom's translation of Josephus, page 639. In this section, it is noted that the writer known as Origen, in his Contra Celsus, specifically states that Josephus did originally write about Jesus, who was called the Christ. Josephus is mentioned by name as having mentioned the previously mentioned individuals: John the Baptist, James the brother of Jesus, and Jesus who was called the Christ. Eusebius also confirms this, and confirmations go on through history until about 1480 CE. Interestingly, Eusebius also uses the term in Greek, a poet of paradoxical works, as a label for Jesus in Demonstration 3.4.21. Josephus, or Arrius, also speaks of others named Jesus, mostly those known to us as high priest ancestors of him, and as covered in my book, royalty and the aristocracy could legally use pseudonyms to write under, and other names to invent characters with. An example of the legal use of inherited name titles and how, when decreed by the Senate, such names and titles could be used even by the person's future descendants is found in a work of Josephus. See the footnote that refers to Suetonius on Emperor Claudius's use of the name Germanicus on page 406 of Wisdom's translation of Josephus. Even though Arrius was speaking of others named Jesus, he appears to have been aware of the opportunities available to him regarding inherited name usage, and he made the most of this by making this powerful statement: "Thus spoke Jesus," even though this was another Jesus who was being spoken of. As mentioned, he makes other references throughout his works, some in the form of joking statements and subtle disclaimers, in other places that point to him as deliberately writing Jesus into his works for a specific purpose. For example, in Against Appian, he subtly refers to himself as an actor. Although these viewpoints of the writings could be considered as being viewed as out of context, when the rest of the evidence is considered, then I must disagree. If we were only relying on those things that would otherwise appear to have been taken out of context, then there might be a case. But what we are doing is only investigating to see more of what Josephus himself was deliberately inserting in other contexts. That's an entirely different thing. In regards to Arrius as Josephus the actor, he wrote, "And for the history of the war, I wrote it as having been an actor myself," which is exactly what was happening within this literature. This man, Arrius, was playing the part of Josephus. In Against Appian, Josephus uses a name that is not seen anywhere else, that name being Crassus, which can possibly be seen as a combination of Christ and Jesus. But it might be a deliberate misspelling, as he is famous for doing. For example, the stone sun quandary. Crassus might be a deliberate misspelling of an ancient Greek king, Mithridates Crestus, an ancestor of the Piso family, which Arrius could have been deliberately hinting at. We should note that if a T was inserted correctly into the spelling of Crassus, it would produce Crestus. See the man who wrote as Suetonius' mention of Crestus. Arrius uses phrases associated with Jesus throughout his works. For example, the light of the world. He also speaks of Christ, for example, and he, in order to fulfill the will of his Father, shall come as a judge, whom we call Christ. It cannot be stated enough that there are deliberate hints inserted in these works and statements throughout them that appear to serve as excuses for making misleading statements and outright lies. They are made when the subject is apparently dealing with some other subject, or non-subject. These things are just added on here and there, so we can presume that Arrius feels he is admitting the truth of what he is doing, but he places these admissions deliberately out of context to their true meaning. Doing this, he probably made the argument to himself that if the reader did not understand his admissions, then that was their fault. Thereby he could carry on writing, knowing that the reader may or may not realize what he has done. An example is the statement, "And where it must be reproachful to write lies, when they must be known by the reader to be such." He is apparently expressing disappointment that the reader must know the writings are lies, but whether the reader does know is another question. Another example is, "Yet were there fictitious stories added to what was really done." Arrius Piso appears to deliberately try to confuse the reader by writing about individuals out of their chronological order. For example, speaking of King Solomon, then Vespasian. Misspelling names, for example, spelling his name as Josephus in places. He says, "Josephus said thus," but to see this you will need to find the Loeb Classical Library edition of Josephus, which have the Greek words spelled as they were in the earliest texts. He also deliberately misleads the reader with half-truths. For example, he, King Herod, was by birth a Jew. This is a half-truth that Arrius Piso would have known. He deliberately perpetuates and invents superstitious notions, ideas and beliefs. He speaks of the skill of expelling demons, and he is the first to speak of a laser root, which in later mythology becomes the mandrake root. He also perpetuates the idea of signs and omens, for example, the omen of the owl, the idea of ghosts, the idea of angels, and the idea of evil spirits and demons. He also presents the idea of fortune tellers and mediums, prophets telling the future and showing signs, wonders and miracles, the idea of witches. He invented the saying of grace, the idea of royal birthright, which we as a society mostly no longer believe in today, an eclipse of the moon as a sign. This and other signs could be predicted with accuracy by the astronomers and high priests of the day. Some supernatural providence. He appears to have promoted the phrase "God forbid," and other signs such as a star resembling a sword and a comet that continued a whole year. If we note, he speaks of these signs as appearing before the destruction of Jerusalem. He writes of religion as being, for those who know what he means, as the most profitable business by saying, to make the altar every day fat with sacrifices of great value. The tithes and sacrifices were divided up by the high priests, who sent a majority to the king of the location. In Judea that would have been King Herod the Great, who in turn sent tribute to the Emperor of Rome. Records were kept so they knew how much to expect to come to them in the form of tithes. They knew exactly what they were doing, asking for 10% in tithes and also receiving revenue of like amount from all citizens from taxes. They were taking great wealth from the populace on a constant and ongoing basis, and that's when the Zealots or Pharisees disrupted this system. Further statements by Josephus include, "A great deal of fictitious blood was shed. O Josephus, art thou still fond of life, and canst thou bear to see the light in a state of slavery?" Of course, Jesus is considered the light, but the character was also the representative of royalty in the story, the Bible, who saw themselves as the light. In other words, those having wisdom and great knowledge as opposed to the common person. The above saying can be seen in a disguised way as Josephus or Arrius, you are fond of life, the good life, and you cannot bear to see this end where the aristocracy is in a state of slavery, as that is what it would be like for the royals if slavery were abolished. It would be as if the royals were slaves to the common person, as they would lose their power over them, and become subject to the masses. In effect, royalty would cease to exist except for family lineage. Therefore it was of the utmost importance to the Herodians, Flavians, and the Piso families that they accomplished their tasks with Jesus and the New Testament, and with the other works produced by the rest of the family and descendants. A statement in Against Appian is quite telling. Some of them betook themselves to the writing of fabulous narrations. For references regarding the Greek texts, please see the Loeb Classical Library volumes. These are the best references for Josephus, as they also show the misspellings were originally in place and were reconstructed with the aid of many fragments of still extant ancient papyri texts and other archaeological finds. For further information regarding Arrius Piso, writing as the man known in history as Flavius Josephus, please see the chapter entitled Flavius Josephus Never Existed in my publication Creating Christianity. There, I investigate that Arrius is recorded under the name of Ficenius Paetus, governor of Syria. It seems he used many created names through the use of nomenclature, including the name L. Ficenius Junius Paetus, discussed in Gavin Townsend's paper Some Flavian Connections, Journal of Roman Studies, issue 51. In the chapter Flavius Josephus Never Existed, I note that Gaius Calpurnius Piso's mother, Arrius's paternal grandmother, was called Plancia Munacia, who was the wife of Gaius Calpurnius Piso, a consul in 7 BC. Plancia's father, Arrius's great-grandfather, was Plancius Munacius, the namesake of his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather. The name Munacia becomes Nunacia, as N is often used as a feminine ending in place of the female M in ancient languages. In Hebrew, M and N can be seen as equivalent. For example, the root of the word maseka is nesek. None becomes non phonetically, producing the name Nonia, and Nonia is a known name of the Balbi family, and Atia infers Balbi, and Balbi means stutterer, just as the name Cellus does, as Arrius as Josephus writes in Life, Loeb 1. Thanks for watching.